Chapter 2, Part 1 of the Spanish Conquerors by Irving, Berdine, Richman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Columbus and New Lands. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars. It may be we shall touch the happy isles. Tennyson, Ulysses. Among the sojourners in Spain prior to 1492 there was a Genoese by name Christopher Columbus. He was tall and well built, of dignified mien, with red hair and beard, a long ruddy face, clear grey eyes, and aquiline nose. To inferiors his manner was exacting and brusque, to equals it was urbane, and to superiors it was courtly. His figure showed to advantage, whereof he was not unduly aware, and he evinced a taste for yellow in beads and for crimson and scarlet in caps, cloaks, and shoes. Unlike the Spaniards whom he was to lead, Columbus was not in disposition primitive. He had no relish for blood and suffering. He was, however, proud, with a measure of austerity, and he was highly romantic and strikingly devout. His most signal powers, and they were signal indeed, were moral powers. In patience, endurance, tenacity, energy, will, powers which, far more than those distinctively intellectual, make for greatness, the world has rarely known his equal. Imagination, too, he possessed, rich and ardent, and it rendered him poetic, eloquent, and persuasive. But just as he possessed the qualities named, so likewise he possessed the defects of them. He was masterful and imaginative, but his masterfulness tended to ungenerousness, and his imagination to vagary and mischievous exaggeration. Nor was this all. His moral powers were largely determined in exercise by two positive principles of action which were undeniably sinister: vanity and cupidity. And under stress of these he became at times dissimulating, boastful, and crafty. It is probable, however, that the sinister in him has by recent writers been somewhat over magnified. Throughout everything he was sincerely and enthusiastically religious. To him, as to others of Machiavellian strain, the end justified many means, but not all, though among the justified means were those of guile. According to the findings of the most recent scholarship, Christopher Columbus, the eldest in a family of 4 sons and 1 daughter, was born at Genoa on a date between August 26 and October 31, 1451. His grandfather probably, and his father certainly, was a wool dealer and weaver, and the latter at one time also conducted a wine shop. None of his progenitors had place or rank, and his sister married a cheesemonger. There were other persons in Europe in his time of the sobriquet Columbus, one of whom, William of Caseneuve, was a corsair and vice admiral of France under Louis XI. And with these Christopher Columbus, about 1501, sought to indicate relationship by the remark that he was not the first admiral in his family. But the claim, so far as can be ascertained, was wanting in foundation. The education of Christopher was of the most elementary sort. It consisted merely of what was provided by a school maintained by the Weavers' Guild of the town of his birth, in a little street called Pavia Lane. How meagre his first advantages were appears in the fact that at no time in life did he assume to write his mother tongue, Italian, not even when addressing the Bank of St. George in Genoa. We have seen that as a man Columbus was both vigorous of body and imaginative of mind. For him, therefore, as a lad in Genoa, the Genoa of our travellers Rabbi Benjamin, Marco Polo, and Ibn Batuta, to develop a taste for the sea was more natural than not. In fact, he tells us that from his 14th year he was accustomed to embark on ships. But in 1472, when he was 21 years old, he declared before a notary that he was by trade a weaver. We may suppose, then, that up to this period his seafaring was tentative, or in the nature of a youth's adventures. Thereafter it became more and more an occupation. In Genoa at this time dwelt two noblemen with whom Columbus seems to have been on terms of friendship. He went with them in 1475 to the island of Chios in the Aegean, where he obtained a shipment of Malmsey wine and became familiar with mastic. In 1476 the two noblemen embarked on a voyage to England, and again Columbus accompanied them in a flotilla, for it was a voyage of importance, which consisted of 5 armed merchantmen. When they were off Cape St. Vincent, who should appear but the corsair and French vice admiral, William of Casenove, alias Columbus. Between the Genoese vessels and those of Louis XI there straightway ensued a desperate struggle. In the end, ships on both sides took fire, and the crews leaped overboard. Columbus of Genoa, the future discoverer, leaped with others, and being fortunate enough to be picked up, was landed on the Portuguese coast near Lisbon, wounded, drenched, and exhausted. Such, in August 1476, was the advent of Columbus in Portugal, an advent certainly fortuitous, if not miraculous, as he terms it. From Lisbon, Columbus continued in December his interrupted voyage to England, stopping probably at Bristol, and it would seem that he even adventured into the seas toward Iceland. "I sailed," he says, as quoted by his son Ferdinand, "in the month of February, 1477, 100 leagues beyond the island of Thule (Iceland). At some period prior to 1503 the discoverer had read the Latin poet Seneca, and found the lines, 'In later ages a time shall come when the ocean shall relax its chains, when Typhus shall disclose new lands, and Thule shall no longer be earth's bound.' Now Columbus took Typhus the pilot as his own prototype, and to make the identification more complete he may have deemed it well that the discoverer of America should, as a preliminary, have fared beyond Thule. In the career of Columbus, Portugal was the first turning point. Hither he returned in 1477 or 1478, and here in 1479 or 1480, after a trip back to Genoa, he married. This event was the reward of his piety. In Lisbon there was a convent of the religious order of Saint Jacques, called the Convent of Saints. Its protégés were bound to vows of chastity, conjugal chastity, not celibacy; and among them was Philippa, a daughter of 2 of the noblest of Portuguese houses, and Philippa was beautiful. Coming daily to the chapel of this convent to make his devotions, Columbus saw Philippa, fell in love with her, and they were wed. To the couple, in 1480 or 1481, a child was born, Columbus's first son, Diego. At this period, too, Columbus became associated in Lisbon with his younger brother, Bartholomew, a prepossessing youth of about 19, astute, of some education, and skilled in the art of limning marine charts. The father of Philippa Columbus was Bartholomew Perestrello, governor of Porto Santo of the Madeira group, and it is a firm tradition that at his death in 1457 he left to his wife Isabel, Philippa's mother, charts and papers which served first to direct Columbus's mind toward great projects in the West. Another tradition, long credited, then long discredited, and now revived, was that Columbus, upon his marriage, settled in the island of Madeira, which is near to that of Porto Santo, and that while he was here, a Spanish ship, which had been driven westward to the island afterwards found by Columbus and named Espanola, came forlornly back, getting as far only as Madeira. Here, so the tradition ran, the pilot of the ship, together with such of the crew as survived, debarked; but the crew, famished and sick, all died, leaving only the pilot. Then he too died in the house of Columbus, but not before he had imparted to his host the amazing story of his voyage, and had given to him his log and a chart of his route. Be the truth of these two traditions what it may, it is a well settled fact that in Portugal Columbus met pilots and captains and was enabled to accompany Portuguese expeditions down the coast of Africa. "I was," he says, "at the fortress of St. George of the Mine, belonging to the King of Portugal, which lies below the equinoctial line." The object of such voyages was largely the discovery of new islands. The Canaries and the Madeiras, the outermost of the Azores, and the Cape Verde group, all were treasure trove of the 15th century, and there might well be others. In these times, indeed, islands rose smiling to greet the discoverer on his approach. Nay, more, where actual islands were not forthcoming, imaginary ones developed in their stead. But were these isles as mythical and imaginary as they were represented? The question is pertinent, for upon the answer depends in good measure what we shall think of the nature of the incentive which underlay the voyage of 1492, the voyage resulting in the discovery of America. The very appearance of islands like Antilia, Salvaggio, Rayella, and Insula in Mar on charts, such for example as the Beccaria of 1435, attests the prevalence of a tradition, and that a mature one, that such a group existed. Such a tradition could probably have had but one origin: chance voyages across the Atlantic from Europe to North America, and especially to the West India Islands of North America. Indeed, in 1474 or 1475, Fernão Tellis sought the mythical Antilia, sometimes called the Isle of the Seven Cities, under express warrant from the King of Portugal, Alfonso V. And in his journal of 1492, Columbus records that many honorable Spanish gentlemen of the Canary group declared that every year they saw land to the west of the Canaries. Again, he records that in 1484, when he was in Portugal, a man, Domingues do Arco, came to the king, John II., from the island of Madeira, to beg for a caravel to go to this island that was seen; and that the same thing, the existence of an island in the west, was affirmed in the Azores. How, therefore, there might arise a story, true or false, of a shipwrecked pilot who gave to Columbus the clue to the finding of the island of Hispaniola, may readily be perceived. But concerning stories of and by pilots, more anon. Columbus had now acquired some knowledge of the theory and art of navigation, and incidentally some knowledge of Latin; and having made up his mind, and as had Telliez before him, that in the Atlantic to the west there yet remained islands and lands to be discovered, he obtained an audience with the King of Portugal, and laid before him a definite proposal. He asked for 3 caravels, equipped and supplied for a year, and in the event of lands being found, for the viceroyalty and perpetual government therein, a tenth of the income therefrom, the rank of nobleman, and the title of grand admiral. According to Portuguese chroniclers writing in the 16th century, the particular land Columbus had in view was Simpangu, or Japan. But whatever Columbus may have disclosed or reserved with respect to Japan, or with respect to Antilia, at this first interview with the Portuguese king, so affronted was the monarch by what he felt to be the vanity and presumption of the petitioner, that he promptly referred his plea to a council of 3 experts, by whom, after some deliberation, it was dismissed. Thereupon Columbus, late in 1485 or early in 1486, left Portugal for Spain. At this point in the fortunes of Christopher Columbus there arises for consideration a peculiar circumstance. Columbus had a double, the well known cosmographer of Nuremberg, Martin Behaim. Like Columbus, this man was born near the middle of the 15th century. Like him, he lacked university training. Like him, his early activities were commercial. Like him, he settled in Portugal, 1480 to 84. Like him, he voyaged to Africa. Like him, he was identified with an Atlantic island, Fayal in his case, and married the daughter of the governor. Like him, he was busied with nautical studies in Lisbon. Like him, he was not highly regardful of veracity. And finally, like him, he died in neglect early in the 16th century. Behaim, however, unlike Columbus, was of patrician ancestry, was instructed in the use of nautical instruments, became a knight of Portugal, and at Lisbon had the entrée to aristocratic and scientific circles. The extent of his geographical knowledge may be inferred from a globe which he completed at Nuremberg in 1492, before the return of Columbus from his first voyage. His authorities included Aristotle and Strabo, Ptolemy, Marcus Polo, and Sir John Mandeville, but his chief authority was Pierre d'Ailly, whose Imago Mundi (World Survey), written in 1410, formed a compendium of the geographical and cosmographical notions of authors such as Marinus of Tyre and Afriganus the Arabian. To put the matter briefly, the ideas of Pierre d'Ailly and Marco Polo are strikingly expressed in this globe, which shows Cathay and India both marked rich, opposite to Portugal and Africa, and about 120 degrees west of the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores, instead of the actual distance of over 200 degrees. Cathay is thus brought forward nearly to the position of California. Cipangu, or Japan, marked as especially rich, falls athwart the position of Mexico, while Antillia lies northeast of the position of Hayti or Hispaniola, and St. Brandon occupies in part the position of northern South America. But why did Behaim take pains to construct a globe? The answer is clear. He had recently, 1486, adventured in a project to confirm his geographical ideas. He had attempted a secret voyage westward to Asia in partnership with two fellow islanders, Fernandulmo of Terceira, a navigator, and João Alfonso Estreito of Madeira, his patron. The enterprise had failed, and yet he did not wish his ideas to be lost or appropriated by another. Concerning Columbus, however, the important question is, was he indebted to Behaim for his own ideas of cosmography, for the idea especially of a small earth? It would hardly seem so. The two men may have met in Portugal, but even if they had, each at the time was guarding a secret, or the approaches to one, Columbus that of islands, perchance of a specific island to be discovered, and Behaim that of a scheme for exploiting Asia. That not very much confidential communication between them was likely under the circumstances may be conjectured. Columbus, according to his own statement, entered Spain after 14 years spent in vain labors in Portugal. As a matter of fact, his stay there did not at the utmost exceed 10 years, probably only 5 or 6. He came accompanied by his son Diego, for Philippa, beautiful daughter of the convent of saints, had probably died soon after Diego's birth. Furthermore, he quitted Portugal, for what reason may never be known, secretly at night. In Spain, Columbus's first objective was Palos. Here, at the monastery of La Rabida, whose guardian, Antonio de Marchena, the future discoverer, is said to have known in Portugal, he found lodgings for himself and a temporary home for his son. The supposition is that at Palos, which as a seaport was the resort of mariners, and where there were many Portuguese, Columbus counted upon obtaining special information with regard to the landfall of some particular early voyage or voyages into the West. But if Palos was Columbus's first objective in Spain, his second was the court of the Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand and Isabella. To these personages Columbus worked his way, so to speak, by the influence of the Duke of Medina Saili, who had wealth, and who at first contemplated assuming in the schemes of Columbus a rôle not unlike that of Estreito in the project of Bahrein, but coming to realize that the affair was one to be accomplished successfully only under royal patronage, the Duke applied to the sovereigns, who commanded that Columbus himself be sent to court. Cordova now for some time had been the seat of government, and here Columbus arrived on January 20, 1486. The sovereigns were then absent, but returned at the end of April or 1st of May, and the coveted audience took place. What occurred is not known. Presumably Ferdinand and Isabella, after a courteous hearing, smilingly put by the question of exploration, for they referred it to the queen's confessor, Hernando de Talavera, an ecclesiastic by no means ungenerous or bigoted, with instructions to summon a council for its consideration. As for the council, not a soul who was a member ever revealed aught of its composition or doings, save Dr. Rodrigo de Maldonado, who says that men of science and mariners were in attendance, no less than literary men and theologues, and that Columbus himself was subjected to interrogation. Talavera's council conferred at intervals for 5 years, often at Salamanca, and at length, late in 1490, reported adversely for Columbus, and the sovereigns accepted the report. In the life of the great Italian adventurer, our future discoverer and admiral, these 5 years are among the most interesting and significant. They mark, it is true, a moral and material decline, but like the first years in Portugal, they mark an intellectual advance. While awaiting action by the council, Columbus was retained at court and encouraged by occasional donations of money, donations appearing on record as made to a stranger occupied with certain affairs relative to the service of their highnesses. The sums in all came to $510, 170,000 maravedis, but small as they were, they had altogether ceased by 1488. In that year it was, or at the end of 1487, the preceding year, that Columbus for a second time fell victim to feminine attractions. The maiden, like his first bride, Philippa, was young, 18 or 20 years old, possessed a beautiful name, Beatrix Enriquez, and doubtless a beautiful person, but unlike Philippa, she was humble of birth and very poor. So lowly, indeed, was she that Columbus did not stoop to take her in marriage, but formed with her a liaison, the result of which was the birth, about August 15, 1488, of his second son and future biographer, Ferdinand. Between the date just given and the spring of 1489, Columbus would seem to have gone back to Portugal under a safe conduct from John II, but why he went, if he did go, is unknown, and by May 12, 1489, he was again in Spain and in attendance upon Ferdinand and Isabella at the siege of Baza. Thenceforth, however, until the final rejection of his project by the sovereigns in 1490, he drops from view, excepting as we are accorded glimpses of him gaining bread for himself and Beatrix in Cordova by limning marine charts, wherein he evidently had been instructed by his brother Bartholomew, and by selling printed books. The vending of printed books may have meant much in that intellectual advance which has been spoken of as characterizing for the discoverer to be the days, sombre or hectic, through which he was now passing. Some years before his brother had fallen on hard times, Bartholomew Columbus had betaken himself from Portugal, where he had witnessed the return of the great Portuguese captain, Bartholomew Diaz, from his discovery of the Cape of Good Hope, to enlist the aid of King Henry VII of England in his brother Christopher's project. Then, abandoning England, he had recourse in turn to France, and now was making himself agreeable at the court of Charles VIII. Thither Columbus determined to follow him, but his departure was prevented by a visit which he paid to Palos, to the monastery of La Rabida, to make further arrangements for the care of his son Diego. This visit, unlike the first, does not seem to have been inspired by a specific wish for light upon voyages with strange landfalls under strange pilots. Columbus was poverty-stricken and for once discouraged. With what cheer he might, he met his friend, the former guardian, Antonio de Marchena, and also, perhaps for the first time, the officiating guardian, Juan Perez, once confessor to Queen Isabella. By these three, under the stimulating zeal of the monks, a plan was contrived. Columbus should thoroughly canvass the maritime section, having Palos for a centre for all possible information regarding pioneer voyages into the Sea of Darkness. The first seaman to be sought out and catechised was Pedro de Velasco, a pilot of Palos itself. Next, after Velasco, an unnamed pilot of the port of Santa Maria near Cadiz was visited. He had sailed west from Ireland, and had, he thought, sighted the coasts of Tartary, not improbably Labrador. Finally, a second pilot, domiciled in Palos, Pedro Vasquez de la Frontera, was waited upon, and what was gathered from him was suggestive indeed. Between 1460 and 1475 he had made a voyage into the west with a prince of Portugal to discover new lands. Their purpose was to sail straight west, but encountering that vast field of marine herbage known as the Sargasso Sea, he had turned back. At this time in Palos, the most important man of maritime affairs was the head of the family of Pinzon, Martin Alonso, best known and bravest of captains and pilots, and to him Columbus would first have addressed himself, had not this mariner been absent with a cargo of sardines at Rome. As it was, Columbus awaited his return eagerly. Pinzon, as it chanced, was at this juncture cherishing a project of his own for exploring to the west, and while in Rome had sought light at the library of Pope Innocent VIII upon lands in the ocean sea. There he had seen a map and a book, both of which, in the form of copies, no doubt, he had brought with him. These documents, according to Pinzon's son, Pinzon the father, not only submitted to Columbus, but gave into his hands. Furthermore, Pinzon and Columbus now went together to the house of Pedro Vasquez de la Frontera, and got him to repeat the tale of how, with a prince of Portugal, he had sailed west as far as the Sargasso Sea, from before which he had recoiled. It was necessary to brave this obstacle, said Vasquez, because by not doing so the prince had failed to find land. If, on meeting the Sargasso Sea, one would but keep straight on, it would be impossible that land should not be found. How, on his voyage in 1492, Columbus made use of a chart whereon he himself had depicted certain islands, how this chart was passed back and forth between him and Martin Alonso Pinzon, and how, apropos of the impending landfall, one of the pilots spoke to Columbus of indications from your book, are incidents well known. Nor is it less well known that on this voyage, after encountering the Sargasso Sea, Columbus, despite protest, braved the obstacle and kept straight on, literally on and on, following as nearly as he could the 28th parallel, till land rewarded his perseverance. Not long after the return of Martin Alonso Pinzon From Rome, Guardian Juan Perez, and perhaps Pinzon, also wrote to Queen Isabella, asking a further hearing for Columbus and his project. The request was granted, and Perez was summoned to court at Santa Fe before Grenada. He set out in a manner truly Columbian, alone, on a mule, secretly, at low midnight. He was soon empowered to invite Columbus to join him. In December the latter came. Ferdinand and Isabella were in receptive mood. Grenada was about to fall, and Spain to be delivered from the Moor forever. A council was ordered, one like Talavera's, composed of philosophers, astrologers, cosmographers, seamen, and pilots. With Talavera's council, however, the primary consideration had been the theoretical feasibility of Columbus's project. With the new council, it was the practical question of ways and means that gave pause. Columbus, repeating with emphasis the terms submitted to King John II of Portugal, demanded of Ferdinand and Isabella a patent of nobility, the admiralty of the ocean, the viceroyalty and government of all lands discovered, and a commission of 10% upon everything within the limits of his admiralty, which might be bought, exchanged, found, or gained. That, in addition, he should demand 3 caravels to cost possibly 2,000,000 maravedis, $6,000, was by comparison trifling. In after years the discoverer of America was wont to complain that in his struggle for recognition in Spain everybody had derided him save 2 monks, Marchena and Perez. Derided he no doubt was, but the cause, perhaps, was not so much his belief in problematical islands and lands as his demand for rewards which, if granted, would raise him to a dizzy height, to a point of rank, power, and riches next to that of the throne itself. As in 1486, so in 1492, in the month of January, to which we are now come, Columbus was dismissed a second time from the Spanish court, and departed sorrowing. The royal flag streamed from the towers of the Alhambra, for Grenada had fallen; but in this event our Genoese took little interest. His course led him toward Cordova, for here was Beatrix Enriquez with Ferdinand, now in his 4th year, and here must now be brought Diego, 10 or 12 years old, from La Rabida. Again, it must have been France, his last hope among the nations with which the thoughts of Columbus were busy. Be that as it may, when but 2 leagues from Grenada, who should overtake him but a royal constable sent post haste by the queen with orders for his return? His demands, one and all, would be complied with. What specifically it was that induced the Spanish sovereigns to change their minds may be only inferred. Whether it was proof of actual islands to the west, proof secretly confided to Columbus at Palos, no one knows. Whatever it was, the lost cause was powerfully pleaded before Isabella by Luis de Santangel, Treasurer of Aragon, and before Ferdinand by Juan Cabrera, his chamberlain, and by Juan Diego of Deza, preceptor to Prince John. The risk was small, the possibilities for God and the realm were incalculable. Such, we are told, was the reasoning. Especially was it the reasoning of Santangel, and so wrought upon by it was Isabella that, seized with enthusiasm, she is said to have tendered her jewels, priceless gems that they were, in security for money for the enterprise. What manner of navigator was this Genoese, this Christopher Columbus, by whom this vast enterprise had been conceived, and by whom it was to be carried out? He was indeed no stranger to the sea, for he had been to Chios in the east, to Africa in the south, and to England in the north. To use his own words, "I have traversed the sea for 23 years, without leaving it for any time worth counting, and I saw all the Levant, and the west, Azores, etc., and the north, which is the way to England, and I have been to Guinea." In nautical skill, the scientific feature of seafaring, Columbus, according to the most competent opinion, was, however, little advanced. He claimed that on his Guinea trips he had verified Alfraganus's calculation of the length of a degree on the equator at 56 2/3 Italian miles. But aside from the fact that at the period of these trips, 1482 to 84, he could hardly have known of Alfraganus or his calculation, for he then presumably knew nothing of the Imago Mundi of Pierre d'Ailly, a book possibly not then even published. There remains the further fact that verification was a process quite too complex for any means at his disposal. His claim, therefore, tends only to prove him guilty of what a stanch admirer does not hesitate to characterize as insufferable braggadocio. But daunted as little by the obstacle of ignorance as by other obstacles, the would-be discoverer held unflinchingly to his role, and when all was over and the triumph won, could bring himself to say, "I had from our Lord a spirit of intelligence. In regard to navigation he made me very intelligent. Of astrology he gave me what was sufficient, and also of geometry and arithmetic. He gave me an ingenious mind, and hands apt in designing the sphere, and upon it the cities, mountains, and the rivers, the islands and harbours, all in their proper place. In this time I saw and studied diligently all the books of cosmography, history, and of philosophy, and of other sciences. Yet for all this confidence, if the voyage of 1492 had depended on the technical knowledge of Columbus, its history would be brief. Indeed, had it not been for Martin Alonso Pinzon, it would never have been made in that year. Pinzon, we may recall, was in 1492 the chief citizen of Palos. After the Spanish sovereigns had decided to sanction and subvention the Colombian undertaking, they gave decree that of the 3 caravels required, 2 should be furnished by the town of Palos in discharge of a feudal liability to the crown, and Columbus on the 12th of May set out from Grenada to make sure of the vessels. The pending expedition was unpopular in itself, and still more unpopular in that its admiral was a foreigner. But at length Columbus obtained the 3 caravels, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria Capitana. So far well, or fairly well, and then a balk. The seamen of Palos unanimously and persistently refused to embark. To them the project was perilous, chimerical, and vain, a subject of derision. Columbus had papers for the impressment of criminals, but to escape this necessity he went to Pinzon, who supplied the sailors on being assured of some share in the enterprise. End of Chapter 2, Part 1.